With COP26 happening in Glasgow in a few weeks' time, governments from across the globe are being urged to take critical decisions to tackle the effects of the climate crisis. And with this in mind, the Africa Climate Week took place this week, discussing accelerating collaboration and integrating climate action into global pandemic recovery, especially as the continent is home to 33 of the top 50 countries most vulnerable to climate change. Well, to talk about the outcomes of the Africa Climate Week, I spoke to WaterAid Regional Programme Manager for East Africa, Ronnie Murungu. Africa Climate Week has just finished, and I wonder, from your perspective, what came out of it?
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. It was an interesting and well-packed agenda that ran from the 26th to the 29th of September, of course, virtually, and hosted by the government of Uganda. It was spread over 3 thematic areas. The first one was around national actions and economic-wide approaches, which was led by the World Bank. And the second tier was around integrated approaches to climate resilient development, which was led by the UNDP. And the last aspect was around seizing transformational opportunities, which was led by UNEP. Quite a lot of discussions, quite a lot of side events as well. And as WaterAid, we had to focus ourselves in the most appropriate track area that is aligned to our mission. So quite a number of issues came out. The first one is around focusing on low carbon development. And this looked at issues around solarization of our development, moving away from fossil fuel. And I think this is a key area for my organization, in the sense that most of the domestic water supply systems, some of them are powered by diesel engines, and we are moving away from that to integrate with solar. That's one example that excited us. That was part and parcel of this. The second aspect which came out as a key was around nature-based solutions. And here we are talking about how we can harness and use nature to actually respond to climate change. And this was also critical for an organization like WaterAid, in the sense that we are trying to protect watersheds, which basically supply us with the water that we drink every day, and using what is within the nature for that. The other aspect, which was also critical, the third point, is around partnerships. I think there was a clear acknowledgement that not all the stakeholders which will be contributing to climate change are participating within this discourse. There was a call around this for increased participation of the private sector, but also bringing in the voices and participation of women groups, indigenous groups, civil society, and different stakeholders as well. And of course, no discussion can go without talking around financing. So looking at financing, I think most of the African countries are working on adaptation. And if you look at the financial landscape, 5% of the finances on climate change are actually focused on adaptation, yet Africa is among the most affected in terms of the impact of climate change. I think the last aspect was around revision and updating of the adaptations plans, which are basically the documents that the countries will be using to implement their actions. So I think these are the major outcomes, particularly on the track areas that we attended to, that are very critical to highlight, but also important to my organization.
talking about your organization, your regional director says that, no conversation on climate can happen without talking about water, access to clean water, hygiene, sanitation, that kind of thing as well. And that a climate crisis actually is a water crisis. What does that mean?
Yeah, that is very clear. I think the impact of climate change is obviously felt through water, either too much of it through flooding or lack of it through droughts. I think if you look at Africa, we are seeing fluctuations between floods and droughts. So floods, they tend to contaminate the clean water that we are drinking, and it leads to increase in waterborne diseases. And scarcity of water is also a challenge. I think we have seen this happen in Cape Town is an example. We are seeing dams drying across the continent in Africa. So this is the reason why, as an organization, we've taken up that narrative, that thematic focus that the climate crisis is a water crisis.
And sadly, and I think you gave us a clue just now, Africa seems to be the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change issues. And I suppose that means that the urgency to find solutions is greater for us.
Yeah, so true. And I think one key issue that came up that was recommended, particularly for this Africa Climate Week, is the increased participation of a number of stakeholders who historically were not part and parcel of this history. Of course, we haven't reached in terms of including everyone, but that increase in terms of participation is commendable. It's an acknowledgement that everyone is feeling the impact of climate change, and we need to bring and join efforts in trying to address this.
Do you think that Africa has enough of a voice? I mean, we've got COP26 coming up shortly. We've just had this conversation, Africa Climate Week. We seem to be the most vulnerable, but do we have a voice commensurate with the vulnerability that we face compared to other parts of the world?
I would say that the voice is increasing. I think in one of the closing remarks, the official from the UNDP indicated that 95% of the countries in Africa have actually indicated an ambition to increase their adaptation actions. And because of this, I think this is an indication that we are committed to increase our effort on adaptation, but it should also match with our voice when we go to COP. Comparing the previous documents, the national action plans, adaptation was very minimum. I think the focus was on mitigation. Yet most of the actions that are required for Africa is how we can adapt to climate change. So we are hopeful that with this incremental focus on adaptation, the voice for Africa will be heard. And we are hopeful that the same participation that we witnessed at the Africa Climate Week is the same participation or more participation when it comes to COP. I think the more voices we have in that platform, the better.
Adaptation comes at a cost, doesn't it? And I suppose this is where the developed nations can assist. How much of a commitment have they made that you think may come through that can help us as a developing continent to adapt?
Yeah, I think I highlighted that if you look at the financial landscape, 95% is going to mitigation and 5% is going to adaptation. But if you look at the revisions in terms of the national adaptation plans and the NDCs, we are seeing a growing increase around adaptation demand. So through these documents, we are hopeful that we are also going to see a shift in terms of financial focus to more on mitigation as well. And I think one aspect that also came from the meeting was reduction in, not reduction, but easing of the processes of how countries could apply for those finances. I think there's a lot of bureaucracy that is associated with applying for those funds. So that is one of the key voices that is coming from the African continent around relaxation of the processes so that we have more adaptation initiatives that will be rolled out.
I'm going to ask you about COP26 just now, but I want to start on the continent and ask you about the commitment from our political leaders, our regional bodies like the AU. Is there enough? Is there enough will to get this job done?
I think with the crisis that we've been facing, looking at the floods that we've been experiencing, looking at the drought, I can give an example of the biggest drought in Southern Africa, what is happening in Madagascar. I think the evidence is right there in their eyes. And we have seen acknowledgement from a number of political leaders around the need to address this. And we've seen quite a number of them talking around re-looking into the urban planning processes to ensure that the green cities come up in Africa, and also to ensure that they address particularly in the case of WaterAid, looking at urban planning and how to address flood issues as well. So I think the evidence is there on the ground in terms of why they need to increase their commitment. And we've seen so much pronouncement from quite a number of them. So we are hopeful that they will bring more voices when they go to the COP.
All right, talking about COP, what is your message to the global leaders there? What do they need to hear from Africa, and what do they need to do in response?
Yeah, I think the message is very clear. The crisis is happening right now. And one, we need to commit more resources in terms of adaptation. We need also to enhance more work around mitigation work, particularly for those countries that are high emitters. I think they should commit to reducing their emissions as well. We have a number of sectors that are underfunded in terms of their adaptation initiatives. I think water is one critical on that one. We need to see more funding around that. And I think lastly is to ensure that there is equal voice, there's equal participation in all these decision-making processes so that Africa is not left out.
Ronnie Murungu, thank you so much indeed for joining us and talking to us about this very, very important issue and making sure we don't forget the link between water and climate change. Thank you so much indeed for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much.